of the kickoff of the Earth Day, but here at the beach. It's kind of Earth Month now in April. So this is our big kickoff event, and it's a student debate. Fossil fuel divestment, is it our salvation? Is it a trap? We're gonna find out. So I just want to quickly also plug another event that's going to happen next Thursday before we get started, and that is a big teach-in event. It's going to be on the central quad near the art building, so upper campus, and that one is climate action and empowerment. So if you're interested in what you can do to take action on issues related to climate change and environmental justice, then come on by. We're going to have free pizza, so even better than those granola bars. There's also going to be a scavenger hunt and a big community organization fair with a number of community groups, so you can kind of see what's going on out in the community as well. And at that event, we're going to have a series of short talks. So the event's on Thursday, April 18th, so a week from tomorrow, noon to 2, and the first hour from 12 to 1, we're going to have a series of short talks. So myself, I'm Dr. House Peters in Geography and Environmental Science and Policy, and I'll be talking about fossil fuel divestment, so kind of leading off from today's theme. We're going to have Nathan York Jr., who's a student, talk about the Green New Deal. So if you've been interested in learning more about the Green New Deal, and then we're going to have a woman, a Perpetua Indigenous woman leader, and an environmental social justice activist. We're going to talk about environmental justice in Wilmington, so if you're interested in environmental justice activism. And then we're going to have researchers from the University of California, Irvine, who are going to talk about asking the right questions in the struggle for environmental justice. And quickly, I just want to thank our team. We're the Interdisciplinary Public Square. And so Dr. Ron Lowe from Anthropology, Acacia Audell from Anthropology, Dr. Michael Eisenstadt, who we have to extra thank because this is the debate team that he'll come introduce from Communication Studies, Dr. Teresa Wright from Poli-Sci, Dr. Melissa Maisaico from Anthropology, Nitra Baghdadi from Anthropology, Dr. Sam Coleman from Asian and Asian American Studies, Amanda Mendoza, and then Luz Carrillo also from Anthropology. So, thank you all, and let's debate.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here today. Thank you for hosting us, Interdisciplinary Public Square. We hope to provide an interdisciplinary conversation on different ways to account for the social and political costs of greenhouse gas emissions today and how that plays a role in the fossil fuel divestment movement. I'd like to get started as quickly as possible, so I just want to do some quick introductions for some of the people that you're going to hear from today. First, we have Harmony Hernandez, who joined the Beach Forensics program about a month ago, and at her debut tournament, which happened to be a national championship, won debates in varsity at a national championship as a first-time debater, so that's pretty cool. We also have Michael Guy, who's an international student from China who has qualified for nationals in his first season in persuasive speaking. We have Kat Lucas-Garcia, who is apparently also in the Honors College, so she gets honors credit for being here today, and joined the team this semester, and in 2 tournaments managed to finish the season as one of the top 4 ranked rookie teams in the nation. So that's also pretty impressive. Last on the affirmative side, we have Emily Rodriguez, who competes in persuasive speaking as well. She won the championship at her first tournament, and so we immediately put her into varsity, where she has been a finalist at every tournament she's attended, and will also be competing at the national championship in persuasive speaking. Over here on the negative, first we have Eli Nemi, who's the treasurer for the Democratic Socialists of America here on campus, a 2-time tournament champion in debate this season, and was also part of the top 3 ranked individual rookie teams in the nation at the national championship last week. This is Rachel Roberts, a returning debater, who is a two-time scholar at the Women's Debate Institute, which is a summer institute designed to advance pedagogy and debate practices for non-males. And she has also placed at multiple tournaments and gotten multiple speaker awards. We have Maggie Frankhauser, who is also a first-year student on our team and was ranked one of the top individual speakers, not just one of the top two-person debate teams, but one of the top individual speakers at the Novice National Championship. And finally, we have Christian Vasquez, who has won a couple tournaments already, was also one of the top 3 individual rookie teams in the nation, and I think has shown up and put in the most hours in our team room out of anybody on the team. So we're trying to keep him around for a little bit longer. So we're going to get started. If either of the teams chooses to use some of their built-in preparation time, I'll use that to kind of moderate what's happening and field some questions, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end to field some additional questions from you all as well. So I hope you all enjoy what we have to bring to the table, and we'll begin.
Climate change is getting worse. The weather patterns are rapidly changing due to changes in the atmosphere, cryosphere, biosphere, and lithosphere. The impacts are becoming more prevalent, and we have a limited amount of time to prevent any runaway warming. According to Millman in 2016, warming could render coastal cities uninhabitable and unleash devastating storms. Humanity would not be able to adapt. And the world is pretty damn close to the point of no return. Greenhouse gas emissions are the primary cause of accelerated climate change, and human activity is responsible for a vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions. Humans have modified the environment to fit the needs of society without thinking of the repercussions, one of them being the very greenhouse gas emissions that we would be discussing today. These emissions need to be cut by about 6% in a year, and top experts agree that this is very urgent. We can't continue down this path hoping that emissions will go down. We have to take some actions. Thus, we are resolved that the United States federal government should establish a tax on greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, starting at a price of $43 per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, rising with the federal estimates of the increase in the social cost of carbon. Additionally, the United States federal government should devote a portion of the revenue toward renewable energy investment and should pursue a supply-side climate policy that ceases leasing of fossil fuel production in federal lands and waters. There are 2 reasons that we should advocate for this policy. A carbon pricing scheme would mitigate the worst effects of climate change. And 2, a carbon pricing scheme would galvanize the support for fossil fuel divestment movement in the United States, which would enable the movement to prevent the green paradox, an undesirable effect of environmental measures. The aforementioned effects of climate change are uninhabitable areas or dislocations of human communities, accelerated water pollution, affected food and water quality, and on top of all these other effects of climate change, the human health is at risk. Changes to water resources can not only affect the water, but also energy production, infrastructure, agricultural, and ecosystems. Agricultural issues can arise through changes in temperatures, pests, and atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. These changes all contribute to the nutritional quality of the food that we eat, and ultimately, the changes to human health. One specific vascular disease is triggered by the involvement of change in temperature. The extreme changing weather patterns have brought re-emerging and new diseases, and the climate has made these diseases maintain sustainability and the ability to multiply rapidly. Williams in 2016 states that although adjustments are costly, these costs are not market failures. The efficient tax will rise at the same rate as marginal damage estimates suggest that the rise are 2% per year. In this argument, we are suggesting for the government to not only implement a $43 per ton of carbon dioxide tax, but also for some of that tax money to be used for renewable energy investment. This carbon tax is the only way that we have to have users of carbon fuels to pay for the damage done on the environment. Not only can we work towards renewable energy with the money collected from the taxes, but by setting this tax in the first place, carbon fuelers will realize that they can reduce their taxes by simply switching to clean energy. When a rising tax is imposed, it might make sense to leave the fuel in the ground forever. It would even be more efficient to start at a higher rate than to start small and then slowly rise up. This will not only be more economically rewarding, but it would lead to energy efficiency. Carbon tax would prevent fossil fuels emitters from moving their activities overseas to avoid paying carbon taxes. As humans, we should work towards finding a solution to the problem we all contribute to for a better future. When making a decision like this, we need to think about how our actions will not only affect our quality of life, but how they will affect the earth we live on now and how it affects our future. If we collectively play our cards right, the incentives could be completely endless. Thank you.
All right, ready?
Yeah.
What aspect of the carbon tax would prevent fossil fuel emitters from moving their activities overseas?
So according to a 2019 report from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Research, the announcement of a carbon pricing policy would send a strong enough signal to both the fossil fuel divestment and the fossil fuel companies that they would likely leave fossil fuels in the ground. This especially is the case since our proposal includes a policy that bans new fossil fuel extraction on federal lands.
How long would it take from the time a carbon tax is signed into law before the tax is actually implemented?
Okay, so our evidence admittedly doesn't state how long the process would take. However, this is a secondary question since the evidence we presented indicates that the perception and signal of even announcing and signaling a carbon tax into law is a necessary step to halt fossil fuel extraction.
What does the carbon tax, or what incentive does the carbon tax in the United States create for other countries, especially major emitters like China and India, to follow suit?
Well, there's two incentives. The first incentive being that carbon tax in the U.S. would spur investments in renewable technologies, and that would fundamentally alter the international energy market. Other major emitters would have an incentive to compete in that market, since the U.S. investments in renewable technologies would damage that profitability of fossil fuel investments.
Thank you.
Oh, and nearly every nation is a World II signatory to Paris Accords, and move away from the fossil fuels is entirely consistent with that accord. So a carbon tax in the U.S. establishes a path that a path for a smooth transition away from fossil fuels.
Thank you.
First, a carbon tax may seem feasible at first glance, but there are several problems with this proposition. First, a carbon tax does not adequately address the issue of climate change. Our first point of contention. We have already reached the point of no return, as the affirmative stated. At this point, it would be far more cost-effective for the U.S. to invest in existing adaptation technologies rather than trying to mitigate the impact of climate change that is already inevitable to occur. Given current resource constraints, as well as the infeasibility of creating a new tax and regulatory scheme to enforce and reduce emissions, the marginal benefits of investing in both existing and future adaptation technologies are far more appealing relative to going down the existing road of mitigation at all costs. Second, there is no reason that a carbon tax would spur any other major greenhouse emitters, such as China and India, from going along. If a carbon tax only solves the U.S. from emitting as much, it doesn't stop runaway climate change. Even accounting for the legacy of historical emissions, developing nations such as China and India account for a much larger percentage of current and predicted emissions than the United States. And adopting a drastic and austere carbon tax regime without securing clear guarantees from other nations will do nothing to solve the problem and only exacerbate existing geopolitical tensions. Our second argument is that not only will a carbon tax prevent the problem, but it will also make the problem worse. The time it would take from signing a carbon tax into law to actually implementing the tax would give fossil fuel emitters plenty of time to accelerate fossil fuel exploitation during this crucial time window, thereby increasing total greenhouse emissions relative to the current trajectory. Economist Sven Jensen reports that this phenomenon, commonly referred to as the green paradox, effectively neutralizes any potential long-term benefits of the carbon tax. This prevents the affirmative from conclusively arguing that the policy proposal's short-term consequences will be outweighed by its long-term benefits in reducing greenhouse emissions. Furthermore, a carbon tax would result in what we call leakages. In other words, there is nothing preventing major emitters in the U.S. from outsourcing their operations to locations that do not heavily penalize fossil fuel emissions, particularly those in developing countries like China and India. In order to win the argument that a carbon tax halts greenhouse gas emissions, they need to provide evidence that either leakages will not occur or that every single nation on the planet will adopt a mitigation regime similar in magnitude to the carbon tax imposed in the United States. Otherwise, the impact of climate change is absolutely inevitable and renders any mitigation policy ineffective. Indeed, given the U.S.'s relatively stringent restrictions on greenhouse emissions relative to other nations, the problem of leakages may exacerbate the problem. Our final argument is that the fossil fuel divestment movement is a pipe dream. Sure, there are universities that have divested from fossil fuel companies, but the market easily absorbs this divestment because there are hundreds, if not thousands, of other eager investors waiting to sweep up the lucrative opportunities offered by fossil fuel extraction. Divestment only works if the divesting agent possesses a disproportionate stake in the asset in question, thereby triggering a significant reduction in the asset market value, which then discourages other investors from swooping in. This is elementary financial economics. As UCLA economics professor Ivo Welch points out, the fact that university endowments only possess a small share of the equity market for major and all fossil fuel emissions, it highlights the limited impact that any divestment program will have. In order to win the argument that the fossil fuel divestment movement can have any impact whatsoever, the affirmative needs to first conclusively argue that all universities and organizations will join the movement. And then they need to win that even if that were the case, that would cause the fossil fuel market to shut down. This requires a massive and coordinated exodus of institutional investors, mutual funds, hedge funds, investment banks, and so on, and millions of individual investors from market assets derived from fossil fuel extraction. This is an exodus and a divestment program that is unprecedented in the history of American finance. The numbers for the affirmative simply don't add up.
The negative has essentially proposed inaction and waiting for adaptation technology. Do you have any evidence that suggests we are developing such technologies or that they will actually be effective?
That's simply not true. We've already proposed, as I proposed in my first argument, only a reorientation of current resources away from mitigation and towards adaptation, both those that currently exist, such as land reclamation, sea walls, and other schemes, as well as those currently in the innovation pipeline. These can all be put into action right away, and the investment for those in the future can easily be put into action. All we need is the will.
And the green paradox assumes that fossil fuel companies will increase extraction in the short term. If fossil fuel companies go bankrupt as a result of divestment, where do they get the funds to expand their extraction operations?
Again, as we've already stated, the assumed bankruptcy of these fossil fuel companies is predicated on the effectiveness of the divestment program, which in turn is reliant on the relative size of the divesting agents. Given that universities only possess a limited share of the market capitalization of companies engaged in fossil fuel extraction and emission, even if every university in the United States were to join, this would only have a negligible effect on the creditworthiness as well as the investment grade of fossil fuel producers and emitters.
At the end of this debate, our audience members need to ask themselves this question: whether is this worth to wait and hope for some utopian technologies to rescue us from climate change, or we need to take action right now to deal with the effects of runaway climate change. We propose carbon tax on greenhouse gas emissions because this is market-based solution, because it not only encourages renewable energies, but also it will provide momentum to growing fossil fuel divestment movement. Now, I will answer negative arguments in order. First, climate change is not inevitable. So our evidence is based on thousands of climatologists' computer models, and it suggested that we have more than 10-year window to develop an effective mitigation strategy. So it not only means that the delay between establishing carbon tax and its implementation will not doom us, but also it's responding negative argument that our mitigation strategy will not be effective. Additionally, if they agree with investment in mitigation strategy instead of the adaptation technology, it would be a great thing. However, we have to understand this. We are decades away from proven adaptation technology such as geoengineering. So the delay between designing all those technologies and scaling to commercial use and even to making them to publicly accessible are the risks we should not be willing to take. And also the chances of those advanced adaptation technologies and preventing those impacts of runaway climate change are is somewhere from zero and near. Second, the green paradox. None of the arguments the negative side have proposed has forward a strong, credible carbon pricing policy that not only send a domestic but also international signal that United States is committed to leaving fossil fuel in the ground. So according to 2019 study by Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, so a domestic climate change policy that we have already proposed will have a great impact on investors' decision-making process when it comes to fossil fuel extraction. So additionally, this study also demonstrates that investors would put out a fossil fuel contract before the carbon tax is fully implemented. Third, the negative side also argued that the corporation in the United States will move to other countries. However, this is not the case. According to Oliver Millman, a professor of climate science at Columbia's Earth Institute, a strong push for a strong domestic carbon pricing policy in the United States will spur a global movement to tax greenhouse gases. So, our proposal will make it extremely difficult for those corporations in the United States to move to other nations because they will face same barriers they will come from in the United States. Additionally, The linkage are occurring right now, even without climate policy in place. So which means that, corporations are moving to the other countries, and even without climate policy in place. So the negative side will do not have any methods or arguments to prevent this. So any actions that would decrease greenhouse gas emissions is better than hoping and waiting. Finally, negative sides also argue that fossil fuel divestment movement is ineffective. However, this is not the case too. There are tons of universities across the United States, especially UC system, have successfully divested from fossil fuel successfully and spurred a local movements that have potential to go up. So the only reason all those movements didn't go to national because there is no domestic climate policy for them to latch onto. So our proposal fixes that by matching the social cost of carbon with a financial tax. So based on all those reasons, I strongly encourage everyone to support a carbon tax in the United States. Thank you.
So if there is a 10-year window to mitigate climate change, does that mean that the affirmative has to win the point that your policy leads to a global carbon tax in that time frame?
No. So based on our evidence, the announcement of a strong carbon tax policy will cause fossil fuel companies to stop extraction. Okay, thank you.
I have one more question.
Go ahead.
The International Panel on Climate Change has said that adaptation technologies are possible and sufficient, so why shouldn't we use them? Why shouldn't we trust them?
Their data research data are, kind of outdated, and our research data are brand new. Based on our research, our, mitigation strategies are more effective. Additionally, we are far away from adaptation technologies. The effects of runaway climate change will have a great impact on us before we invent any, some sort of advanced adaptation technology.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Is the affirmative ready?
Yeah. Although the affirmative has presented some persuasive arguments in support of a carbon tax in the United States, they have not sufficiently demonstrated that it can prevent the worst impacts of climate change, such as the greenhouse gas crisis. Don't be distracted by the emotional persuasiveness of the impacts of climate change. There is unfortunately nothing that the carbon tax could do at this point to reverse what's already been happening for decades now. The unfortunate reality is, climate change is inevitable for a laundry list of reasons. Other countries, other powerhouse countries, will continue emitting greenhouse gases. According to David Wasdell, director of the Apollo Gaia Climate Institute and author of Climate Dynamics, Facing the Harsh Realities of Now, the increases in temperature that have already occurred will lead to what's called a feedback loop. When changes occur in the environment, such as the conservation of carbon, it will actually increase global temperature. Computer simulations of these effects predict an increase of at least 6 degrees Celsius and would only increase as we continue. That makes mitigation impossible. Furthermore, the time frame for establishing an international tax on carbon could take actually forever, since all other nations would need to be on board. It's important to recognize just how long these kinds of implementations actually take. Let's use our own campus as an example. According to a message from our university president sent out yesterday, Cal State Long Beach has promised to achieve climate neutrality by the year 2030. 2030, y'all. That is 11 years from now. And we are just one small pocket in the massive nationwide problem here. If our own school needs a whole decade and more, What makes the affirmative think that our whole country could do it any quicker? And the effect of this wait will be detrimental. According to Sven Jensen, a PhD in economics and professor of economics at Oslo University, even if a carbon tax stunts fossil fuel extraction in the long term, the short-term acceleration of fossil fuel extraction far outweighs the benefits of a carbon tax and cites multiple studies in climate economics to back up this claim. Additionally, what would we realistically be replacing fossil fuels with? Previous efforts in the United States to subsidize renewable energy have simply not caught on. The solar market, the wind market, the geothermal market have all essentially failed to effectively compete with fossil fuels. The affirmative hopes to invest in technologies that simply won't cut it. Not to mention, these methods are reserved for the privileged. Teslas and honestly even Priuses are not an option for the majority of people, and making transportation more difficult will harm the majority of Americans, especially people and communities of color and other marginalized groups that simply do not have access to renewable energy. The affirmative has not adequately responded to our arguments about the green paradox. According to Michael Lazarus, a senior scientist and director of the Stockholm Environmental Institute, a demand-side climate policy like a carbon tax will accelerate fossil fuel extraction, accomplishing the exact opposite of what the affirmative is trying to do. This is a huge deal, and it's impossible to avoid with this plan. You should prefer this evidence over the woefully optimistic evidence that the affirmative has presented, because Lazarus has conducted studies that speak to the psychological and the market reaction of corporations not only in the US, but worldwide. That means even if the affirmative is correct, that they would spur a global movement for a carbon tax, corporations won't just give up fossil fuel extraction. We can't ignore the elephant in the room. Capitalism, time and time again, has interfered with noble initiatives such as environmental conservation, and will continue to do so. Corporations will still be able to dig for fossil fuels overseas, which is what we call leakage. And let's be real, corporations can't even successfully recycle, let alone abide by a carbon tax. They're always going to find loopholes. This argument isn't about not caring about the environment, it's about being realistic. Had we started this conversation, I don't know, a few decades ago, it might have been different, but we're simply too late. It's important that we analyze this situation with the most realistic lens possible. Thank you. Yeah.
So, have previous efforts to subsidize renewable energy been coupled with a domestic climate policy that restricts greenhouse gas emissions?
Not necessarily, but just because a plan sounds like a good idea on paper, that doesn't take away from the glaring flaws that we've articulated in our evidence. This plan essentially doesn't do anything for the green paradox, for leakages, or for international damages of carbon emission.
Okay. So our proposal has two parts. We have the carbon tax, and then we also have a restriction on fossil fuel extraction on federal lands. So how do fossil fuel companies increase extraction when our proposal essentially bans companies from developing new sites for fossil fuel extraction?
Yes, because this ban would take like 5 ever to be enacted, and that would give companies all of the meanwhile to accelerate their digging, which is what we call that short-term acceleration. Plus, once the ban is eventually enacted, that would still only apply to federal land and US soil, which wouldn't prohibit any other country or leakages to continue to dig overseas. Okay. Thank you.
In this debate, the negative team has consistently shown that companies will simply leave the United States if the country imposes a carbon tax. The first piece of evidence we give to support this loophole is fossil fuels in other countries. Even if the affirmative bans fossil fuel extraction on federal lands, they cannot enforce leaving fossil fuels in the ground in other countries with looser regulations on the environment. Going off of this point, several other countries that lead the world in greenhouse gas emissions have an incentive to accelerate fossil fuel extraction in a world where the United States has decided to stop doing so. Countries like China or India want to be global players in the energy market, so there is no clear reason that they would work alongside the United States and adopt a carbon tax. Not only has the negative team given a good reason to oppose the carbon tax, the affirmative team has no compelling argument for why a carbon tax would galvanize or strengthen the fossil fuel divestment movement. Our evidence directly contradicts their claim that a fossil fuel divestment strategy would work. According to Eva Welch, a professor of economics and finance at UCLA, there is no empirical example of a fossil fuel divestment strategy working because it would only take 30 minutes for the market to entirely absorb its impact. We also have evidence from Sven Jensen, a professor of economics at the University of Oslo, which states that since fossil fuel companies are on the supply side of the market and a carbon tax is a demand-side policy, it is difficult to imagine a world in which the movement succeeds. It's an illogical solution because they are simply economically incompatible. Additionally, fossil fuel divestment movements will backfire. According to Bernard Weinstein, a professor of economics at Southern Methodist University, when an organization joins the fossil fuel divestment movement, they inhibit their ability to influence fossil fuel market and no longer get to act as a stakeholder in energy policy decisions. Furthermore, if the fossil fuel divestment movement fails, and if corporations can just move elsewhere, investing in a carbon tax is counterproductive to the goals the affirmative has outlined and directly trades off with investments in adaptation technologies that are necessary. These are three very compelling points which support the negative argument and prove that the affirmative argument is ineffective. Thank you. Everybody ready?
All right, y'all. At the end of this debate, everyone in this room needs to remember that the negative side is encouraging that we do absolutely nothing in the face of rapidly accelerating climate change. If our proposal for a carbon tax makes even the smallest difference to mitigate the effects, that in itself makes all of the difference and is why you should support the affirmative's carbon tax proposal. The numerous studies in our evidence that we have given has shown that a carbon tax can not only overcome the green paradox, but will also inspire the rest of the world to develop renewable technologies and tax greenhouse gases. Our evidence is also newer than the negatives, which makes it more relevant to right now. Although climate change may not be inevitable now, sitting around and waiting for new technologies to develop makes it inevitable. Every argument that has been made about why the rest of the world would not adopt a carbon tax cuts both ways because those countries would not develop those same adaptation technologies that supposedly exist. Actually, having a proposal that tries to prevent climate change from worsening is better than doing nothing at all. With every piece of evidence the negative has argued against our use of a demand-side policy, they have completely ignored that we have also proposed a supply-side policy that bans new fossil fuel extraction on federal lands. The negative's evidence does not account for that supply-side policy at all. The affirmative also has evidence from scientists, economists, and international scholars that support the carbon tax, which boosts the credibility of our proposal. If they support us, you probably should too. The fossil fuel markets have already been affected by the fuel divestment movement, which tells you that it is already happening today, right now. Stakeholders have withdrawn their funds from fossil fuel companies, took that same money and invested in proven renewable technologies. And since those same stakeholders also bring added subsidies to renewable markets, a seamless transition to leaving fossil fuels where they belong, in the ground, is completely possible. So there really is only one way to go from here, forward. You should support the affirmative's proposal for all of these reasons. A carbon tax would make a positive change and would bring the rest of the world to a movement that halts fossil fuels from being extracted. The alternative is to stay stagnant in the face of climate change, and considering that both sides have agreed that climate change is happening and accelerating, we can't have that. Thank you.
technology available to us currently cannot support the massive usage of fossil fuels. It would be devastating to companies and to the economy if we push for alternative energy that was not ready to meet the demand that is currently being met by conventional means. It would be immoral to push this policy upon the people of the United States who would feel the brunt of this market crash. We must first find a way to transition away from fossil fuels in a way that doesn't trigger the effects of market failure. Furthermore, we cannot ignore the fact that people who feel the crushing weight of alternative energy prices are those of low-income communities. It would be unjust to not analyze the ways in which this privileged approach to climate change affects those who are already being the most affected by climate change. In addition, the inevitability of companies leaving the U.S. from the terrible climate to operate their commerce leads to an increase in the prices of goods consumed by all, but felt differently by everybody. This also exposes the problem of companies simply getting around the tax by either leaving the country altogether or by finding some loopholes to exploit in order to avoid the tax and continue operations as normal. And this is important because climate change is a global issue. Everything that the affirmative has laid out for us really pertains to domestic policy, things that we can do here. But climate change isn't just happening in the United States. It's happening everywhere. And to just simply assert the fact that we can do something here somehow leads to positive change everywhere is simply illogical. We must also think about the public's political capital on something like climate change. If we legislate something on this issue and do not take into account the impacts felt by the polis, then the people are likely to refuse legislation later in time that would really be ready to deal with the impacts. We cannot act prematurely because the risk of not being able to effectively address this problem later in time would be to the detriment of all. We agree that we must do something, but is that something that should be done? That's the question of this debate. Is it something should be done, but we have to think about how that something affects everybody. It is because of these reasons that we should reject the carbon tax, so that we are able to develop technology and infrastructure to successfully make the transfer from fossil fuel to renewable energy. Additionally, we have to think about how the political capital that we lose by trying to act upon a serious issue before the solution is fully developed because of the inhibiting nature of public backlash to a failed policy. So at the end of the day, what we're thinking about here is it better to do something that won't actually solve the problem and actually create more problems? Or is it better to do nothing and to wait and see how we actually solve this problem in the most effective manner? Thank you.
Ready?
97% of climate scientists worldwide have given us less than a decade to do something about climate change. The negative in this debate has essentially just asked you to wait it out and hope that some magical new adaptive technology appears and that every nation across the globe will adopt it. Our proposal for a carbon tax may be imperfect, but it also may be our only hope. They argue that we need to be realistic, so let's be real. This is what we need to do now, or else this issue will only continue to exacerbate. This isn't about saving the polar bears. It's about saving ourselves and ensuring a quality of life for those who come after us. We've proposed a demand side and a supply side policy that not only keeps fossil fuels in the ground in the US, but also sets a model for other countries to follow with lucrative opportunities for renewable technologies. Every single piece of evidence that the negative has offered in this debate only assumes a demand side policy, not both. None of their evidence speaks to both of these policies in tandem with the growing fossil fuel divestment movement. Corporations are finding loopholes now. They're already sending emissions to other countries, and they cannot possibly extract quickly enough if we implement this carbon tax. This will only cause lasting damage. Now, none of these arguments are reason to oppose the carbon tax. That we've provided here, we've got new studies that suggest the benefits of announcing a carbon tax would only ensure that there would be no green paradox. Moreover, we've presented evidence that the negative has not directly refuted that the carbon tax in the United States would cause a global following, because the same countries that are competing with the US would not want to miss out on the renewable market and let the US hold a monopoly over all of those technologies. In summary, a carbon tax in the US would have immediate global impact on climate change and would give the fossil fuel divestment movement a boost that it needs in order to have a national and international effect. For these reasons, we strongly advocate for the carbon tax in the United States, and that has been the best chance for mitigating the worst effects of climate change. The choice is yours. Do we give up or do we act now? Thank you.
So before we open up for some questions at the end here, I just want to say a few things. First, thank you again to all of the members of Beach Forensics who agreed to come here today and put on a little bit of a show for you all, and thank you for being here for whatever reason you happen to be here, whether it's you chose to come here or you're here for a class. Okay? One thing that I can say about Beach Forensics and the transformative power of speech and debate is that 7 of the 8 of the people up here joined our program this season. These are people who, for the most part, had no background in speech and debate. And I think you can see that over the course of one season, or in some cases, one semester. These folks have developed public speaking skills, confidence, research skills, and they're engaged with not only each other, but their communities. Beach Forensics is a full-service program that welcomes anybody at any time with any level of experience, and we have a full coaching staff that travels the country and competes with U.S. universities and universities across the world. So if anybody at any point is interested in learning more about our program, you should feel free to contact me or talk to me after. But please, before we take questions, give a round of applause again for the members of Beach Forensics. We do have some time for questions if there are any.
How does the positive or the negative contend with the technology of nuclear power? And with or without the carbon tax?
Well, so in this debate, there's kind of an underlying conversation about what happens to renewable markets if fossil fuels are no longer in the conversation. And although in this particular setup, we didn't get into the details of which kinds of renewables would be subsidized, there is a healthy debate in energy economics and energy policy in general about the kind of capacity for nuclear power to replace fossil fuels. One of the things that we would immediately have to tackle in the United States is where nuclear waste goes and how we can recycle it, because I come from the state of Nevada where apparently we have secretly been using the mountain as a repository even though we decided we weren't going to do that. So we would have a lot of problems to solve when it comes to nuclear technology, because we obviously wouldn't want another Chernobyl or Fukushima, and we also wouldn't want to be storing our nuclear waste in indigenous land.
The against did speak about the impact for people of color. I want to know what the for wanted to say about that, because they did bring up a good point. How would the for be able to subsidize or assist those that would be most impacted on the loss of carbon?
So that's a great question. In case anybody didn't hear it, the question was about how a carbon tax or a domestic climate policy restricting greenhouse gas emissions impacts people of color, communities that are less well off when it comes to their socioeconomic status and so forth. How do marginalized populations kind of navigate a situation in which fossil fuel extraction has been restricted? And the affirmative's argument in this particular debate is that that is the status quo. The conditions for people, the environmental justice movement points out that there are things like brownfields where when we go to dump toxic waste or when we go to create new oil rigs or places to drill, those are typically established in places that are already next to neighborhoods that need the most help. Where are the landfills in Los Angeles? Where are the landfills when you go elsewhere? They are in places where people need socioeconomic help. And so the affirmative did kind of take a defensive approach here and say, that's a status quo. There's only a chance that kind of stopping fossil fuel extraction can improve the life conditions for people who are most affected by it. But something else that I think we could add to that conversation is that fossil fuel companies love to exploit places where we aren't paying attention and we need to be paying attention to. And a carbon tax or a domestic climate policy that would restrict greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, that would subsidize renewable technologies, would be the first and necessary step to helping communities that need it the most get away from exploitation from fossil fuel companies. The negative in this debate was absolutely correct, that when we introduce a new technology, it is prohibitively expensive. Right now, I think the cheapest Tesla is like $35,000, and you basically get a box that you can charge and drive to places. That's true, but that's what there was a conversation about why the money and revenue from a carbon tax should go towards subsidies for renewables, because when you have a supply and demand side policy, that allows renewable technologies to scale quicker, it allows them to go commercial quicker, and the faster that they are commercialized, the faster you can buy them at your local store on the cheap. It used to be prohibitively expensive to buy a drone, but now you can buy a drone at a gas station in some places for $15. And it's only because those technologies have been subsidized somehow, and those subsidies eventually allow it to commercialize fast enough that it goes back down to the public. And the affirmative has proposed a supply and demand side policy to account for the criticisms that opponents of a policy like a carbon tax make when it comes to getting the benefits of those policies to the people that need them most. We have time for one or two more questions, maybe.
May I ask a question? It's okay. Well, I'm interested in the divestment issue, and the no side said that divestment isn't a meaningful strategy unless we can be pretty confident that all universities and all community public institutions divest. And even then it might have to be a significant solution because we create more investment opportunities for other players, maybe international investors. How would the affirmative respond to that? Or
I think in this case, one of the affirmative's arguments is that critics of the fossil fuel divestment movement aren't thinking about environmental justice or climate policy writ large. They're only criticizing the movement itself as though the movement exists in this vacuum and it doesn't have any resources or help and it doesn't have any way of building momentum. So the argument that we need to take a demand side policy and a supply side policy like a carbon tax and a ban on new fossil fuel extraction on federal lands is the kind of spark that the divestment movement needs to kind of make itself known and heard on a national scale, to get other organizations and universities to withdraw their investments, because otherwise a university by itself has such a minor investment in the overall energy market that withdrawing its funds doesn't really change anything. But the combination of that movement with action in the legislature does have a larger impact, and that is kind of the post-dam study that the affirmative was referencing a few times in this debate, is a brand new study that kind of analyzes market forces as the divestment movement moves along, assuming different policy outcomes. So just a demand side policy or just a supply side policy, or the combination of those two kinds of policies with members of the movement. All right, well, I hope everybody enjoyed this experience. Thank you for being here, and thank you again to the Interdisciplinary Public Square for sponsoring this event.
And if you didn't